Okay, thank you, sir. John Paul. Good evening or good morning to everyone listening this evening in our place. Am I audible, sir? Is it
Yes,
clear?
yes, yes, we can hear you.
All right. So, uh, to ensure a bit of clarity, maybe I'd have to turn off my video or my camera na lang. And I'll be screen sharing uh, the PowerPoint slides that I tried to make, right? For a while. Okay, here. Is it already visible, sir?
Yeah, if you want, you can i-landscape siya.
Yes.
Yan,
Okay.
better.
Okay, so we'd have to begin with the life of Aquinas. Okay, so after all, the thought of a certain person is best understood if we first understand uh, his life. I think that's understandable because our ideas are conditioned by the culture and the society that we are in. So before we begin diving into his thought, first we have to have an overview about his life. Now, I made I prepared a lecture for some other talk back then on Aquinas' five ways specifically. Uh, Aquinas has a natural theology that is quite popular. That means that he presents arguments for God's existence, and among his arguments, there are many arguments that he raised that he made for the existence of God. Some of them are the five ways, and maybe we can talk about this at some other point. I cannot dive deep into the five arguments themselves because there's so much more in Aquinas. So just to let you know, let you know that we can also talk about that perhaps in the Q&A if you want. Okay, so life. Let's begin with his early years. Okay, so but before that, I'll be using the book by Dr. Eleanor Stump, the scholar that Sir JP mentioned earlier that we invited. I think that was a year ago. He has a book entitled Aquinas. It's quite thick, but we'll just be using it as a reference for this lecture. So Aquinas lived between 1224 to 1274. So he lived an active, demanding academic and ecclesiastical life. So he is a professor, yes, of theology specifically, biblical theology specifically. He's a master in theology or master of the sacred page. So at that from that fact, we can already tell that he is not a rationalist, right? So there's a misconception about Aquinas that he is a rationalist. What do we mean by that? By the term rationalist, it is a term typically used for somebody who believes in the content, for example, of divine revelation, only because and only insofar as these uh, doctrines are provable by the light of natural reason. No, Aquinas is not like that. He believes that the contents of divine revelation, yes, can be pointed to by natural reason, by arguments using the natural reason, but it must involve also the act of faith. So the act of faith is a free act. If the doctrines of faith can be proved by the light of natural reason alone, the arguments of natural reason compel you, force you to believe, for example, in the mystery of the Trinity, for instance, in the mysteries regarding Christ's resurrection. But that's not the view of Aquinas. For Aquinas, faith is a free act. It is not forced by the intellect. It is free, yes, and it is moved also not just by human free will, but also by grace. That's just a brief overview. That's just a brief correction, perhaps, of a common misconception about Aquinas as a rationalist. He thinks there are propositions that are knowable to be true apart from natural reason. Okay, so one of them being the Trinity. By natural reason, we can know that God exists using arguments, philosophical arguments, but it is only through divine revelation that we can know that God is a being with three persons, right? A single reality with three persons, in three persons. So that's it. So the focus must be on the one hand on Aquinas as a scholar, yes, as a professor, yes, but at the same time on him as a priest, okay, as a theologian, a priest. So he offers mass every day. He either offers mass, he offers mass every day, and he also assists in mass, a second mass, I think. So he offers or assists in at least two masses a day. So that shows us that he has a strong spiritual life, right? Okay. He had a short life. He died in his 40s. So he already did a lot of things, even if he had only 40 years of life on earth. So we could only imagine if he lived 80 years, for instance, what he could have produced. He nonetheless produced many works, yes, varying in length from a few pages to a few volumes. Okay, so the most important of his works are Summa Contra Gentiles and Summa Theologica. We'll be talking about these works later on. And he's typically described as an Aristotelian. Aristotle, remember, is the student of Plato, right? Whereas Augustine is said to be primarily an Augustinian, is primarily described to be a Platonist because Augustine used the ideas of Plato in the common understanding of Augustine. He used the teachings of Plato and baptized it, in the sense, into Christianity. And Aquinas is said to be doing the same, but no, not for Plato, but for but for Aristotle. So that's the brief overview of some of the things that we have to learn about him. So in his early years, so Thomas Aquinas was born in Rocaseca. Okay, Rocaseca. He is the youngest son of a large Italian aristocratic family. So they are quite rich. He comes from a rich background. Nevertheless, we are not sure when his birthday really is. Is it in 1224, 1225, or 1226? So what's sure is that it's just at some time near 12, maybe we can say 1225. Okay, it's the middle one between them. He began his schooling at the Benedictine Abbey at Monte Cassino. Okay, so one of the ambitions of his parents for him is to be the head of this great monastery, Benedictine monastery. So his parents let him study there, okay, as a kid. But later on, due to some issues or fights between the Pope and the emperor at that time, and his family, the family of Aquinas, is closely related to the emperor, so that Aquinas would have a chance to be close to the Pope, so that he could be appointed as the head of that monastery. He was sent by his parents somewhere else. Right? He was sent to the University of Naples. So there, the tension is quite. I think the tension is not as strong. So in 1224, he joined the Dominican friars. Okay, so this is important. In the university that he studied in, one of his professors was Peter Abelard, who was a Dominican. Peter Abelard has so many contributions in various sciences. even in natural science, he was a Dominican, meaning in the Catholic Church there are various religious orders, right? One of them is the Benedictines, who at that time were quite we, we might say elite. We might say elite. But the Dominicans are mendicants, meaning the Dominicans, on the other hand, roam around the streets preaching to the people with zeal, but they typically do not have money. And therefore, they have to ask for food, for example, from the people and other goods from the people. The family of Aquinas wants him to join not the Dominicans, but the Benedictines, right? And in fact, to be head there because they already noticed that Aquinas has a superior intellect. So they objected to Aquinas's intent to join the Dominicans to follow his professor, which is Peter Abelard. That's why, while at one point, when the Dominicans ordered Aquinas to go to Paris for further study, his family had him abducted, okay, en route. So while going to Paris, he was abducted by people who were ordered by his parents so that he cannot become a Dominican, to stop him from becoming a Dominican. There he was kept at their home for 2 years. No, I don't think that he was treated badly. He was treated well, but his parents tried to convince him to be a Benedictine, not to be Dominican. Still, his brothers tried to hire a prostitute to seduce him, right? Because they think that Aquinas is very rigid, right? He has a very strong zeal to live the life of mendicant, right? So maybe a sin can reduce his rigidity or his zeal, right? So perhaps that was at the back of the mind of his brothers. But Aquinas angrily chased that prostitute out of his room. He took the fire from the took a burning wood, I think it was, from the furnace and chased away the girl. And it is said that he locked the door and used the fire, the hot wood, to draw a cross at the door. So that was how strong his conviction to be a Dominican was, and that also was that shows that he really tried to live a holy and saintly life. Okay, so now his family already surrendered in their desire to force Aquinas to be a Benedictine. So in 1245, Aquinas was allowed to return to the Dominicans, who again sent him to Paris, this time successfully. So now let's go to the University of Paris. There, he encountered Albert the Great, right? Who became his most influential teacher, right? So it was Albert the Great who introduced Aquinas, right, to Aristotle, because at this time, the texts of Aristotle were just recently discovered, okay, again, for study. So there was quite attention regarding the compatibility of Aristotelian metaphysics, Aristotelian thought in general, with Christian theology. But nevertheless, Aquinas and Peter Abelard were convinced that no, they are actually in harmony. That's why they still tried to study Aristotle. They find it fruitful to study his work. When Albert moved on to the University of Cologne in 1248, Aquinas followed him there, having declined Pope Pius IV's extraordinary offer to appoint him abbot of Monte Cassino, while allowing him to remain a Dominican. So that's quite that's a very tempting offer, right? But still, Aquinas refused it. Aquinas just wants to live as a simple Dominican. Okay, Aquinas seems to have been unusually large, right, and extremely modest and quiet. When during his 4 years at Cologne, his special gifts began to be apparent, despite his reticence and humility, Albert assigned him the uh, sorry, Albert assigned him to be his to take part in an academic disputation. Okay, so having failed in his efforts to shake his best students' arguments on this occasion, Albert declared, "We call him the dumb ox." So when we hear about the term or the nickname the dumb ox, because he's big, right? He's stout and he looks dumb. That's the stereotype, right? Of somebody who is stout and maybe he's just good at sports, perhaps, or have you a strong body but a weak mind, right? So that was a typical perception of his classmates, for instance, on him, that he is a dumb ox. But Albert said, "We call him the dumb ox, but in his teaching, he will one day produce such a bellowing that it will be heard throughout the world." Okay, so Albert really saw the potential of Aquinas. There's a story about Aquinas when he was young, wherein his classmates told him, "Look, Aquinas, the look at outside Aquinas. There's a flying pig, right?" So of course his classmates expected him not to believe it, but he believed it. So that's an evidence that they had that he is actually dumb, because of course pigs cannot fly, right? But his response, the response of Aquinas, was that I'd rather believe in something that is quite dumb to believe in rather than believe that a Christian friend of mine would lie to me. That's the sort of innocence and purity of intellect or mind that Aquinas has. He tries to be charitable in out to heart towards his friends, right? It is on account of this purity of his intellect that and the purity of his heart, right? That he is not a slave to the passions. Okay, and because of that, his mind is always active, right? It was always at work. That's why that accounts for the superior intellect that he has. Okay, so it is because of the purity of his mind that his and the purity of his soul, right? That his mind is only busy with things regarding God, right? That's why he is among the greatest theologians in this uh, in the Christian tradition. So in 1252, Aquinas returned to Paris for the course of study leading to the degree of Master in Theology. So this degree, Master in Theology, is roughly equivalent to PhD today. So that's the highest degree that one can have at the time. During the first academic year, he studied and lectured on the Bible. So this is actually his main work. His main work is not to be a teacher of philosophy, although we know him for that much more today. His main work was to be a commentator of the Bible. So that's it. On the one hand, he loves philosophy, yes, but he is primarily a biblical scholar. That's why, for example, in the Summa, we find so many quotations of scripture out there. He's not the best, perhaps, exegete at that time, but still, he has a very high view regarding the Bible. Okay, so there, in order for the degree of Master's in Theology to be given to him, he first had to write a commentary on the sentences of Peter Lombard. Okay, so that's why he finished it. So there was we can skip the controversies regarding why his degree was given at quite a later date. Let's just proceed to uh, the sentences, his commentary on the sentences being the first of his four theological syntheses. So he wrote many syntheses. He was synthesizing, for example, the church fathers, right? He quotes Aquinas a lot. He quotes Leo the Great. he quotes Gregory, he quotes so many of the church fathers. He also quotes scripture, and he quotes the philosophers. So he tries to get the best arguments from or data from these authorities in order to defend his arguments, right? So that's why he is typically regarded even by secular scholars, secular philosophers, as the great synthesizer, right? His project, in his project, he was able to synthesize the best of both Greece, right, natural reason, and Jerusalem, right, faith, right, scripture, and the fathers, the patristics. The rest of his theological syntheses are Summa Contra Gentiles, right, Summa Theologica. So notice Summa, right, summary, synthesis, and also the Compendium Theologiae. So among them, the Summa Contra Gentiles and Summa Theologica were Theologiae were the most important, we might say. During that same period, he was able to, while preparing for his master's in theology degree, he also wrote an important work, a little work entitled De Ente et Essentia, on being and essence. I think we have to talk about this later on. In here, we can already find his rich metaphysical vision, right? This, according to some Thomists, is one proposition that was being written here is one of Aquinas's contributions, right, to the history of thought. It is his view of the primacy of the act of existing. So we can talk about that later on. But already in the Ente et Essentia, even long before he wrote his Summa Theologiae, right, we can already find that contribution. Okay, so we can proceed with his first Paris Regency. Sir JP, how much time do we have left for for this part regarding Aquinas' life?
10 minutes pa.
Can you repeat it, sir? I cannot hear.
10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes.
10. Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you, sir. So first Paris Regency. In the spring of 1256, Aquinas was appointed Regent Master in Theology at Paris. Okay. So he held that until 1259. There, he wrote Questiones Disputate de Veritate, okay, disputed questions on truth. It grew out of his professorship, right, which obliged him to conduct disputed questions. Which obliged him to conduct several formal public disputations each year. So every year, professors will welcome questions from the audience, right? And according to other sources, this was done during the Lenten season, right? Lenten season, so that the suffering that the professors would have to undertake in trying to answer these difficult questions would be offered up, right, in penance. So in Catholic theology, that is actually helpful, right, to pay for one's sins, for example, or the temporal punishment due to sin, etc. We can talk about that at some other point. That's it. Disputation was normal in the life of Aquinas, right? In the life of the medieval university. That's why it's important, I think, to connect this to Nietzsche, right? Nietzsche said that Christianity had a very high view of truth, right? That's one of the contributions of Christianity. Its high view of logos, of truth. And eventually, at the modern period, it is that very same reason, right, that was already becoming so valued in the West that eventually overturned faith. Maybe Nietzsche was wrong in that assessment, but that's it. We see in this culture of debate the value of the medieval period for truth. That's why when we look at the arguments of Aquinas, for example, in his natural theology, he was not just arbitrarily making them up just to win arguments against, for example, atheists. No, that's not his intent. His intent was to draw out, to tease out the implications of his view of reality, right? His metaphysics. So he, instead of trying to win arguments, his main intent was the truth. And it just happened that his search for truth led him to believe in his metaphysical system, from which he draws out as an entailment the existence of God. So that's it. The elaborate structure of each of those articles, right, of his Questiones Disputate, there are many of them. But the structure, like much of Aquinas' writing, reflects the scholastic method, right, which, like medieval disputations in the classroom, had its ultimate source in Aristotle's recommendations in his topics regarding dialectical inquiry. Aquinas' philosophical discussions in that form typically begin with a yes or no question. So each article then develops as a kind of debate. It begins with arguments for an answer opposed to Aquinas' own position. These arguments are commonly, if somewhat misleadingly, called objections. So we notice here that one of the reasons why we love Aquinas is that he does not strawman the position of his arguments. What do we mean by that? He does not present a weaker version of the arguments of his opponents. He tries to steelman it instead. What do you mean by that? He tries to give it the most charitable interpretation. Right? He assumes that his interlocutor has the strongest argument against him, and then later on he tries to refute it. So that's a virtue that we can follow, right, from Aquinas. After that part, the
Mark,
objections. Yes, sir.
are you still in the same slide? Hindi
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, sige.
Yes, sir. Still in the same.
Okay,
Okay.
sige.
So, conducting disputed questions was one of the duties of a regent master, right, in theology. But the theology faculty also provided regular opportunities for collegial questions. So we can Aquinas also had commentaries on the De Trinitate of Boethius, right? We're still talking about the first Paris Regency here, and then De Hebdo Madibus, right, of Boethius. Aquinas also had a commentary on that. We can talk about more. So, but we can now move to the next part, which is Naples and Orvieto. There he wrote the Summa Contra Gentiles, and then many biblical commentaries. Okay, so maybe we can talk a bit about his commentary on Job, because that's interesting. His Expositio Super Job ad Litteram is one of the most fully developed and philosophical of his biblical commentaries, rivaled in those respects only by his later commentary in Romans. The body of the book of Job consists mainly of the speeches of Job and his comforters. So it's all in itself, the book of Job is rich, right? Intellectually speaking. So Aquinas sees those speeches as constituting a genuine debate, almost a medieval academic disputation. So that's a sort of presentism on his side, right? He assumes that the culture that he had at that time is similar to. He reads that into Job, but that's still fruitful, right? And then one of the key points of Aquinas there was that God sometimes withholds answers to our question why we suffer, and God sometimes does not respond to our need for comfort in the sense of the elimination of the suffering. Why? Because that is for our greater good. So that's a difficult idea to swallow, but that is quite true. Aquinas says that think of a doctor, for instance, who has a patient for whom a bitter medicine is the only type of medicine that can cure his illness, for instance. Suppose the patient does not want to drink the medicine, to take the medicine, because it is bitter. Would the doctor just say, it's all right, you may not drink it? No, the doctor would insist, right? The doctor would insist on him, on the patient drinking that medicine, because that is the only way for him to be cured. Suffering is like that. It's like medicine. It's bitter, right? But it is the only means by which we could be detached from comfort in this world, from the satisfaction of pleasures in this world, right? It is the means of holiness. It is by suffering that we are conformed to Christ. So that's it. In a sense, that's part of Aquinas' solution to the problem of evil, right? So we can talk about Rome, but we have to skip that part. He wrote many commentaries on Aristotle, right? And it is said that sometimes, or at many points even, Aquinas' texts, which are commentaries, for example, on Aristotle, are clearer than the originals. Why? Because Aquinas is able to see the inner logic, right? The inner logic of the argument, of the points of those original texts. For example, from Aristotle or Boethius. Then he wrote the Summa. Okay, that's the most important work. Maybe we can talk about the contents of that later on. Then his second Paris regency. Then he was called for a council, right? And while upon going there, his head was he hit his head. I think it was, I cannot recall where he hit his head, but that was the cause of his death. But before he died, there's a story about him saying that all that at one point he had a mystical experience, right? And then at that point, after that mystical experience, he told his secretary, Brother Reginald, that everything that he wrote, including his Summa, which was yet unfinished at that time, right? It is a feat for him to be able to write Summa Theologica. It is in many volumes, right? Question part one, part two, having a first part and the second part, and then part three. It was a huge feat. It definitely is not straw in our eyes, but for him, it looks like trash. It looks like straw compared to what he has seen during that mystical vision. Some say that some writers on Aquinas say that it is actually by meditating and putting his ear close to the Blessed Sacrament, which is the Eucharist, right? Which is stored in a tabernacle. It is by leaning his head on the tabernacle, that he gained the insights that he was able to write in his masterful books. At this point, before his death, he was not able to finish his Summa. Why? Because he was already experiencing that mystical vision. His outlook totally changed, right? Because he saw that was a quasi beatific vision, right? In a sense, he saw that the truth himself is very rich, to be able to be captured by the limitations of human finite understanding. Okay, so I think that those are the most important parts regarding his life. Maybe we can proceed with the Q&A. But before that, there's this paper by Romualdo Abulad, wherein he talks about Aquinas and postmodernism. It is, at least according to Abulad, it is a fact that we are already living in an age of postmodernity. But interestingly, Abulad sees postmodernity already in Aquinas. That's quite a bold claim, right? But in what sense? Maybe Abulad is wrong about this, but maybe he isn't. He says, he compares Aquinas to Wittgenstein, right? Remember, Wittgenstein eventually said that his prior works are straw, just like Aquinas, right? Not in exactly the same way, but we find the quote here of Wittgenstein saying, "Anyone who understands me eventually recognizes my propositions as nonsensical when he has used them as steps to climb up beyond them." Right? He must, so to speak, throw away the ladder after he has climbed up it. So there's a growth in the intellectual development of Wittgenstein, wherein he was able to say that everything that he wrote beforehand was like straw, right? So why study Aquinas? Why study Aquinas when at this point it seems like his science, for instance, his views about how physics works, it seems outdated, right? And maybe you disagree with his theology, but why study him? We must study him because it is only after we have already mastered what has been thought before that we are in the position to be able to responsibly try to go beyond it, right? To refute it and to contribute to advance the discussion. So in other words, here he says the ladder can properly be dismissed only by one who has full command of it. So since Wittgenstein was already able to master the limits of his prior thought, it is only after that that he is able to have the he gained the right, in a sense, to refute it. So suppose you want to refute Aquinas. If you're an atheist, you do not want to believe his arguments for the existence of God. All right, that's fine. But make sure that before doing that, you understood him on his own terms first, right? If you're a Protestant, for example, and you want to disagree with his sacramental vision, right? His view that God typically uses instrumental causes that are visible, right? That are sensible by the human being. All right, you can disagree with that. But first, try to understand him first. Okay, so I think that's a fair request to make. So that would be all, I think, regarding the life of Aquinas.
Yes, thank you Mark for the part 1 sa life and of course yung contemporaries ni Thomas Aquinas. And I really do believe the statement that was given yung bandang last part wherein it is proper for us to understand first, especially yung mga prior church fathers natin, hindi lang yung early church fathers but even yung medieval and scholastic fathers. And in order for us to make a proper theological perspective, hindi lang sa kung ano yung meron ngayon but even sa past. One major thing I believe, Mark, is that coming from a more Baptist and Protestant perspective, I think marami sa amin sa denomination and even sa aming faith group, we would always go directly to Augustine, right? So yun ang nangyayari. Very Augustinian ang mga Protestant and Reformers to the point of dismissing yung importance ni Thomas Aquinas. And that itself speaks kung bakit malaki yung yung division and split ng both Roman Catholic and even ng Protestant views. Wherein, if you're going to actually learn church history, hindi naman fully talaga yung isolation and divorce sa Thomistic perspective. I do love how Thomas Aquinas put together faith and reason and really made it useful, di ba? And then, yeah. So yung claim nung isang presenter kanina, I think tama naman yon, pero in some way very anachronistic, pero at the same time there are many traces na yung kung ano yung postmodern perspective that we have right now. Actually meron din nag-start kay Thomas Aquinas and later kay Friedrich Nietzsche, di ba? At doon din kay Schleiermacher. Friedrich Schleiermacher would really give us kung sino tayo ngayon, kung paano mag-isip yung tao ngayon. And then that itself, again, if you do not have that kind of understanding of the past, hindi mo ma-explain kung ano yung meron sa present. Di ba? Parang lagi lang tayong in a sense, parang mob mentality. We just accept and embrace the things that we have right now instead of critically thinking what happened before in order for us to give light of what's in the present and what's coming to the age, di ba? Kung ano yung parating. And with that proper understanding, yung mga gantong discussion would really help us, di ba? Parang, especially for us na mga young thinkers, would really help us build yung ating communities. First is kanya-kanyang communities for us to really have yung progress sa ating human society. So yeah, Q&A. Then after that, after ng Q&A, we can have 5-minute break. Gusto nyo tumayo, pumikit, magkape. Kaso gabi na dyan, no? So if you want to do that, you can do that. Pero if you have questions, I think anyone? Try natin. So saan ulit nanggagaling iba? Let me try, no? Si Zuriel, you're coming from?
I'm from Davao, brother.
Saan?
Davao. I'm at
Davao.
SPBTS ngayon. At your sister.
Okay.
Seminary. Yeah.
So SPBTS kay Dr. Ongon.
Yeah.
Yan, so Davao. And si Rez, Davao din.
Also from Davao, yeah.
Davao. Si Ben Hur is nasa Cagayan, pero Cagayan sa may north, sa may Tugigaraw banda. So si Rovic, I think he's in Thailand. Pacheco is in Parañaque. Uziel is in Manila. Ivy is Las Piñas. Si Charles Rosales, I'm not sure. Pero
He's from Zamboanga. I'm not sure.
so any questions or any, I know sa inyo yung part na ng CTT, napag-uusapan niyo na si Thomas Aquinas. Again, ang purpose ko lang nito, and I reach out to Mark, Steve, is to really have a small group, especially for me and my friends, na 5 kami, 3, 5, na magkaroon ng basic introduction when it comes to Thomas Aquinas. So meron kayong tanong kay Mark? Anin Zurel?
I was ano lang yan, kind of curious. Do you study metaphysics like Thomas Aquinas in your graduate school?
Yung question na yun sa akin ba?
Oh yeah. Jan particularly sa Southwest.
And then ako medyo malayo yung aking yung field of interest.
To Mark, Mark, do you think back in that certain era, do they have when he was teaching about, like, example, his metaphysics, was it widely accepted again, or did he try to like teach it for several years? How many years did he have to teach the doctrine before, like, the divine simplicity and stuff like that became widely accepted, or even top point placed in a certain pedestal with the church?
Thank you, Brother Zariel. The reception first was that it was seen as heretical. His entire system was seen as heretical by the bishop, I think, of France. I think that's why. Why? Because some interpreters of Aristotle saw, for example, Aristotle's views regarding the eternity of the world, right, to contradict Christian theology, right? So, in other words, because Aquinas is a very strong follower of Aristotle, they think that there's no way to reconcile Aristotelianism with Christianity. Okay, so I think that's the first one. So Aquinas at first was, in fact, seen as a heretic by some, but eventually, just 50 years later, he was canonized. That's a very brief time, right, between the death and the canonization process. Typically, one becomes canonized only after hundreds of years. But that shows that Aquinas eventually, after his death, for example, I think after his death, that he was able to convince the church that no, actually, Aristotelianism, in fact, supports the Christian faith in a sense. In Aquinas' genius way of doing it, they're actually compatible. And in fact, now, for example, we can find the encyclical by Pope Leo the Ninth. Sorry, Leo the 13th, right? Aeterna Patris. It's almost the complete turnaround from the first claim that Aquinas is a heretic, because now Aquinas is seen as the norm, right? The common doctor of the church. So we can read, for example, in his encyclical, he writes, for this reason, the supreme pastors of the church have always held that it is part of their office to advance with all their power, knowledge, truly so called, but at the same time, to watch with the greatest care all human learning shall be imparted according to the rule of the Catholic faith. So that's a call for orthodoxy, right? Especially is this true of philosophy, on which the right treatment of other sciences depends in great measure. Wait. He says here, Aquinas remains to this day. Sorry, I think I missed the part, but he says that Aquinas is the Catholic philosopher. I think that's the gist. So the church was able to value philosophy, and among all philosophers, the church singles out Aquinas as the norm. So he says here, he traces the root of all evils which are now overwhelming us, right? And among them being the evil teaching about things humanly defined from the schools of philosophers. So the church is also very clear that Paul is in some sense right, that philosophy can sometimes really counter or be against the Christian faith. But in the case of Aquinas, he is seen as a sure guide. But that is not to say that Aquinas has no mistakes. Because, for example, Aquinas rejected Immaculate Conception, which is a dogma of the Catholic Church, right? Why? Because Aquinas was not able to discover that there's a way to reconcile to reconcile the universality of Christ's salvific work with Mary being preveniently saved, right? If Mary had no point in her life that she had original sin, how could she, in a sense, be saved, right? When she was not a victim of sin in the first place. Aquinas was not able to resolve that. So, because of his Christocentrism, he focused on Christ's universal salvific work. But later on, John Duns Scotus was able to find a way out. So the point here is that eventually that first reception of Aquinas as a heretic was overturned.
Yeah.
Thanks, bro.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, and at the
Thank you
same,
for the question.
again, going back, prior to Aquinas, most of the church fathers in the early church fathers, they're more Augustinian, and Augustinian is following very Neoplatonist. Kaya medyo meron talaga split division when it comes to their philosophy theology. Pero sa not contemporary, pero century before Aquinas, there's also another person who's doing this, si Anselm of Canterbury. Is also towards logical syllogism, yung paano niya defend yung Trinity, purely reason. And it's also a good book to read, Anselm of Canterbury. It would help us, kaya marami ding, hindi naman lahat, pero marami ding nag-follow later on kay Thomas Aquinas because yung towards Renaissance, yung towards enlightenment with pure reason is meron doon. Pero again, Mark Steven argued na hindi nga purely rationalistic si Thomas Aquinas. And also, we do agree with that kasi nga sininthesize niya talaga yung faith and reason. Yung revelation of God is really again, if we have another question, kung wala, we can take 3 to 5 minutes. I think 5 minutes 4 minutes na lang para sa 9:15. 9:15 here. So 10:15 there in the Philippines. We can start. So, mayroon bang question? Wala? Mamaya na lang ulit kayo magtanong sa dulo. Okay, so 4 minutes. Let's have a break time. You can stand. Tapos, pwede kayong magkape. Tapos, balik tayo ng 10:15 p.m. Philippines time. Zuriel, you can invite siguro ilang friends na gusto mong mag-join. Yeah. Pero wag marami ha. Ano lang, tama.
Of course, yeah.
Para ano lang tayo. Small group discussion lang tayo. Okay? Welcome Jerome Ocampo from Muntinlupa and Christine Fodra from Baguio City. So, be back at 10:15.
Hi to everybody. Nandito kami ngayon sa nandito kami sa park ngayon. So, habang nagle-lecture ay namamasyal kami dito sa mga pailaw. So, kung nakikita mo, nakikinig pa rin ako. Gusto mo makita yung pinakamagandang place dito. Pakita ko lang sa'yo. Dito ako sa loob ng
binavlog
Ayan, nandito po tayo sa loob ng Star. Ayan po. Nakikita mo yan? Oh, ha? So, yung mga pakulo dito sa Dataran, yun. Namamasyal kami ngayon. Ayos ba? Masyal kayo rito.
Sige, makinig ka lang ha. Meron, magpapatuloy kami sa'yo mamaya.
Dahil mo alam.
Patay. Jerome. Ay, Sir Jerome. Buti nga kayo, may mga ano na kayo. Sweetheart kayo. Doon, namamasyal ako mag-isa. Oh. Kawawa naman ako eh. Wala akong partner sa buhay.
Okay. Sige na, mag-mute ka na ulit. Makinig ka na ulit.
Sige po.
Okay, let's be back. Parang meron tayong short advertisement doon. At least may short commercial. Thank you, Benur, for that short commercial. Pambira. So, welcome Jerome Ocampo. So, si Jerome Ocampo is isa sa mga rin dito, no? Nag-help para mag-host sa atin yung understanding yung introduction to Thomas Aquinas. Again, with the purpose of we would just like to steer yung mind ng bawat isa and coming from both perspectives, Roman Catholic and Protestant, specifically Baptist understanding. And again, Mark's event ako itself is very we call ourselves parang Bapto Catholics, and Bapto Catholics are also tracing our roots from yung Catholic faith, and that Catholic faith from the purely yung 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, 4th century, Augustine. Later on, of course, nagkaroon na lang ng mga mismatch, mga mishaps in between dark ages hanggang many of us continued following yung reformers, and marami sa evangelical perspective napunta naman ng mga liberal theology because of the Enlightenment and Renaissance. And yeah, and makita mo talaga napakalawak ng Christian faith. And if we are not ready and prepared to reconcile and understand one another, it would be hard for us to live together and live alongside. Kasi lagi, no, I don't know if you're familiar with this kind of context. If you're going outside Philippines, like if you go to India, Nagaland, Myanmar, Protestants and Roman Catholic faith are seen as parang brothers and sisters talaga. So very, very close, no? Parang lagi silang magkakampi. Especially here in States. So sa States, merong evangelical and Catholics together na tinatawag. Pero pagdating sa Pilipinas, parang silang parang magkaaway na hindi naman dapat talaga magkaaway, and that's really sad. And we have this kind of platforms for us to really see that we have the same goal. No, first of that one is really to glorify God and really impact yung ating mga smaller communities to really see na we are following God's revelation, God's for God's glory. So after that, I think let's go to the part 2, and part 2 po natin will give another 30 to 40 minutes kay Mark to present yung thoughts naman. Kasi kanina life ni Thomas Aquinas, this time naman thoughts ni Thomas Aquinas, yung kanyang theology and philosophy, and yung dual theme na pag-iisip ni Thomas Aquinas. Mark, you can begin. Naka-mute ka pa, Mark, ha?
So, share my screen. So, Aquinas is a really rich thinker, right? So, normally, I cannot give justice, expectedly, I cannot give justice to the intellect of his thought in just one night, much less in 30 minutes or 40 minutes. But I think we can give it a try. But before that, it was Dr. Barrett, right, that you mentioned earlier, Sir John Paul? He
Yes,
has an
yes.
article. He has an article precisely on this. Right? He wrote that some Protestants would say, never carry anything by that Popish heretic. By that he met Aquinas, and he listed many myths, right? 25 myths about Aquinas that somehow motivate that idea. And maybe we can do a bit of negative theology or via negativa, right? As an introduction to Aquinas. In other words, we'll talk about what Aquinas does not think more than what he does think, right? Just to eliminate the misunderstandings. So he said one of the myths is that Thomas allowed Greek philosophy to corrupt Christian theology. That's not entirely correct. That's not entirely correct because in the view of Aquinas, Greek philosophy itself was already uh, preparing humanity to receive the richness of Christian theology, right? So, in other words, uh, the the Lord who bestowed on the Greeks the gift of reason, natural reason, is the same Lord that gave us divine revelation, right? Through Scripture. So, in other words, there's no contradiction between them. The former does not corrupt the latter in the former in itself, right? Reason in itself does not corrupt the latter. In fact, the reason uh, is that which is elevated by divine revelation. There's a very smooth continuity between them. So that's it. That's not true. That Greek philosophy, as viewed by Aquinas, is a corruption of Christian theology. In fact, it is by means of the clarity of thought that the Greeks gave the world that, for example, we are able to articulate the doctrine of the Trinity in a quite intelligible way, right? In a systematic way. So much more can be said about that, but let's proceed to the second one. Thomas merely baptized Aristotle to construct theology. For example, Thomas baptized Aristotle's unmoved mover without major metaphysical adjustments or improvements. So that's it. Is that all that Aquinas was doing? No, because Aquinas himself moved beyond Aristotle, especially, for example, regarding in areas when Aristotle got things wrong, right? Aquinas knew that Aristotle got things wrong because data from divine revelation, for example, shows that Aristotle was wrong on some things. For example, regarding God as God can still be God is actually the creator of the world, right? And that God is a creator of a finite, temporally finite world, right? So Aristotle seems to not to believe that the world is finite, right? So that's it. So Aquinas also went beyond Aristotle when Aristotle does not see the logical consequence of his own views. For Aquinas, we can talk about this more later on. Aquinas uses the four causes of Aristotle, for instance, but uh, he moved beyond it by positing a further cause beyond the four causes, which is this further cause is the act of being itself, which is the act of all acts. It actualizes all actualizers, right? With those four causes, matter, form, etc. We can talk about that later on. Being subordinate to this cause that Aquinas is focusing on, which is act of being. So three, Thomas was primarily a philosopher, not a biblical exegete or theologian. That's not also true. As we saw earlier, his primary work was to be a master of theology, right? Okay, four, Thomas was a rationalist, allowing reason to reign autonomous and dictate theology. So it's not true, right? In fact, reason was seen by him as subordinate to faith. The richness of truth that we are able to know through theology, for example, at the end of his life, he saw that the truth about God supersedes everything that he wrote right beforehand. So no, he does not believe only that which is provable. Five, Thomas's use of natural theology was actually advocacy for natural religion. No, that's not true, right? Natural religion is the belief is the rejection of, for example, miracles, right? Because it's in some sense deistic, right? That's natural religion. That's not true because Aquinas believes in miracles. In fact, Aquinas believes that it is by means of miracles that we are able to ascertain whether a particular claim of divine revelation is authentic. It is actually from God, right? For example, in the Christian faith, it is by means of miracles, like, for example, the resurrection, as emphasized by recent apologetics, right? That's a Thomistic idea in a sense. That's similar to the belief of Aquinas, that it is by means of miracles that we are able to know that it is Christianity that is the religion that is truly rooted on divine revelation, right? Instead of counterfeit revelation. So Aquinas believes in miracles, right? 6, Thomas's God is impersonal. No, that's also a misunderstanding. God in Aquinas is, in fact, tri-personal, right? God is a Trinity, and the second person incarnated, right? He's Jesus Christ, right? The incarnate Word. 7, Thomas was a pantheist, or at least a panentheist, both of which he never denies or refutes. No, Aquinas has a clear distinction between creator and creature. For Aquinas, nothing that is creaturely, for example, everything that is not God is necessarily finite and therefore not God. We can talk about the theosis as his rest later on if you want, but Aquinas' view is still compatible with a view that God became man so that man might become God. But there's a nuance there that we can spell out later on if you want in the Q&A. So it's also false that Thomas represents a scholasticism that is speculative and elitist. No, it is in fact very practical, right? His Thomism is very practical. His scholasticism is very practical. It's not head knowledge alone. For example, there's a very good book on this by Peter Kreeft, right? Peter Kreeft is not an academic, is not a professional philosopher in the sense of one who focuses on publishing academic works. He is a popularizer in philosophy, as he himself says. But he has a very good book called Practical Theology, wherein he quotes 365 texts from Aquinas, from the Summa Theologica, and shows that Aquinas' theology, his work in the Summa, is very practical, right? It has implications on how to and what to do regarding, for example, the reception of the sacraments, for example, or how to be a saint, right? How to be holy, etc. How to endure suffering, etc. So there's so many practical points in Aquinas. So it's not totally speculative. It's also false that Thomas betrayed the classical methods, theology, and spirit of the church fathers. That's not true, because in fact he builds on them. For example, Aquinas quotes Augustine more than he quotes Aristotle, right? I hope that's clear. He's more a patristic than he is a philosopher. But more than Augustine, he quotes scripture the most. So in other words, he's very steeped in Christian theology. He does not try to go against it. It is the air that he breathes, in fact, right? the patristic way of thinking, and even the way of worship that the fathers had, for example, the liturgy of the fathers of the church is the very liturgy that Aquinas celebrates every day, right? So that's it. His way of thinking and his way of acting is very patristic. So there's no betrayal there. Number 10, Thomas was a Pelagian, or at least a semi-Pelagian. He was not an Augustinian. That's not true. Because for Aquinas, Aquinas really believes that grace precedes all salvific acts of the human being. Even the very first response of the human intellect and the human free will to revelation, right? That leads one to faith. That itself is drawn by faith. That itself is drawn by grace. So grace precedes every salvific human act. So he's not a Pelagian, right? Because for Pelagians, works could bring you to salvation apart from grace, or at least it works. Grace only makes it a bit easier, but in principle, works alone without grace could bring you to salvation. Aquinas rejects that. Okay, Aquinas rejects that. So for Aquinas, grace works from beginning to end. 11, Thomas was the target of the Reformation. No, because many of the reformers were, in a sense, appreciative of Aquinas, right? We can talk about that some other point. 12. Thomas is the gateway to Roman Catholicism. Also, Thomas invites dialogue between Roman Catholics and Protestants that can only lead to ecumenism and compromise. Now, on the one hand, I agree that I actually think that Thomas can be a gateway to Roman Catholicism. So maybe I can disagree with Dr. Barrett a bit here, because once you understand the vision of Aquinas, uh, once you see that it makes sense, that could really lead you to believe that eventually his own religious beliefs are true, right? So, but not necessarily, right? Not necessarily. It's not only a gateway to Roman Catholicism. But yes, you do not have to uh, believe everything that Aquinas believes just because he says so. Okay. So, in other words, uh, you do not have to compromise anything in your Protestant beliefs in order to understand Aquinas, because understanding and judgment are distinct, right? Understanding is simply the grasp that certain propositions are true. You can grasp something without accepting it, right? Without affirming it as true. That's it. But sometimes, once you grasp that certain objections that you had to a certain view of Aquinas, for example, actually do not work, that sometimes could remove the stumbling blocks that you had against Thomism or Catholicism in particular. But the point here is that it does not lead to compromise. You do not have to compromise your pre-held beliefs. No 13. No respectable reformer appreciated or appropriated Thomas once they converted to the Reformation, and certainly no reformer remained a Thomist. That's not true. I think Dr. Barrett can better explain who these reformers are. I'm not very familiar with the tradition, but I know that they exist. 14. Thomas was accurately presented to Luther by late medieval scholastics and Luther's contemporaries. There's the argument that no, actually, the Thomism that Luther, in a sense, rejected is not the accurate Aquinas, right? It is a corrupt interpretation of Aquinas. 15. But that is not to say that Luther actually agrees with Aquinas' thought itself, right? The point here is just that there's much misunderstanding in the sense no, not misunderstanding, but there's a difference in Aquinas as received by Luther from Aquinas himself. 15. Thomas led Protestant scholastics away from biblical methods and theology of the Reformation. It's not true, right? He's a master of the sacred page, right? 16. Thomas was mistaken on justification, so none of his insights can be appropriated for soteriology. Now, I think he is not mistaken on justification. So that's where I would differ here. So, but it's right that even if you do not believe that he's perfect on his views on justification, you can still understand his insights and appropriate them for your soteriology, right? Because some of them are actually coherent. Perhaps you can discover that for yourself if you try to study his works on salvation. 17. Thomas created dichotomies and strict dualisms between the natural and supernatural, between body and soul. Not necessarily, right? Because there's a very strong continuity between the natural and the supernatural in Aquinas. In fact, he has the concept called obediential potency, right? Obediential potency. What do we mean by that? It is the inherent tendency of the natural to be actively receptive of supernatural work, of divine action that makes it act in a way that is beyond its nature. So that's it. So here, body and soul are not actually very opposed in Aquinas. They are working together. It is the soul. The soul is the formal cause of the body, which is the matter, right? So there's a strong coordination between them. So 18. Thomas taught transubstantiation because he was a slave to Aristotelian categories. I think that's not true also, because he is convinced that Aristotelian categories are true, right? By the light of natural reason, you can discover that the categories that Aristotle discovered are actually true. They correspond to independent reality that is independent to the human thought, right? So in other words, they're true. Because they're true, then you can use them, you can apply them to understand the data of divine revelation, right? Which is known either, in the view of Aquinas, either through scripture or through sacred tradition, right? Sacred tradition being the body of belief that was handed over from Jesus to the apostles to the rest of the church. across time. So, in other words, he believes in transubstantiation not because he is an Aristotelian. The motive of his belief in transubstantiation is that he believes in divine revelation, right? He believes that the content, the substance of this doctrine is already taught by the apostles and by Jesus Christ. And then to explain that in a clear and rigorous way, he just applied what he already knows to be true from metaphysics, right? The notion of substance, accidents, etc. And I will try to present a bit of that later on. 19. Thomas is identical with the textbook Thomism of the last century. That's not true, right? Because sometimes Thomism is presented in the last century as very focused on, we might say, distinctions, right? So that's good. Distinctions need to be made, right? But sometimes one of the criticisms against that period was that it is done too much, right? And the focus on contemplation, right, and some mystery is forgotten in a sense. So the mystical dimension of Aquinas is sometimes forgotten by just a focus on clarity and thinking. So it must be balanced, right? Because Aquinas, as we know, is a biblical scholar, and he is also he has a mystical life, right? He is in a sense a mystic, right? He reports to Brother Reginald that he had visions of God. So that's it. That's not reflected in the textbooks of Thomism in the recent century. Okay, 20. Thomas was rejected wholesale by modern Reformed theologians, etc. I think it. I think Sir JP is in a better position to speak about this because I'm not very familiar with the Reformed tradition. Thomas has been accurately understood and therefore successfully refuted by these people. I cannot speak about this. 22. Thomas is rejected by the best Reformed theologians today. I think James Dolezal is Reformed. I'm not sure, but he accepts much of Aquinas, right? He argues for example, classical theism as opposed to neoclassical Thomism. Neoclassical theology or theism, championed by. I'm not sure if I'm correct about this interpretation of the current views of, for example, Craig, etc. But the point here is that Reformed theology is not in itself allergic to Aquinas. Okay. 23. Thomas is irrelevant to Protestantism and its history, as both evangelical and Roman Catholic historiography assumes. No, it's very relevant. So because there are Thomist Protestants, you cannot understand their works if you do not understand Aquinas, right? So 24. Thomas's argument for God is the equivalent of evidentialist apologetics since the Enlightenment. That's not true, right? Because I think the point here is that there's a main difference. Evidentialists, at least in their crude form, use arguments just for the sake of persuasion, right? Maybe I think maybe this is not a fair characterization of all evidentialists, but there's a tendency even in Catholic evidentialists. Some of them would just use arguments even if those arguments are not, they themselves know are weak, right? So that's in a sense evidentialist. If that's evidentialism to you, then Aquinas is definitely not that sort of evidentialist, right? Because he only uses arguments because he finds them to reflect how the world really is. So 25. Thomas has been read by evangelicals. A majority of the Summa conflicts with evangelical theology. No, it's not true. Much is actually a point of agreement, right? Christ is divine, right? He's the human and divine nature. Christ is the second person of the Trinity. Charity is the foremost virtue, right, etc. So, in other words, Aquinas is a really rich point of agreement, even if not in all respects. So let's talk about Aquinas' metaphysics for a while. So this illustration is from Norris Clarke's how do we call that book? The One and the Many, right? So this is a summary of his entire metaphysics, and let me spend a bit of time to talk about this. So for Aquinas, following Aristotle, reality, right, or being, right, reality could be divided into those that are natural, meaning reality in itself, meaning that which is independent to our mind. We call that real being, right? So there's an argument that real being is not the perfect term for this, but we can adopt this for now. The first distinction is between complete real being and, on the other hand, mental being. Okay, mental being. So mental being, for example, is an example of a mental being is uh, mermaid, for example, or a phoenix, for example, or flying spaghetti monster, for example. That's mental being. That is contrasted with real being. I mean, the cell phone or the computer that you're using now. Myself, who is talking to you, we are real beings, right? So now, among all real beings, we can distinguish two, in a sense, parts. Let's just call these parts as of now, right? Even if that's not very precise. So, for example, for example, let's talk about a banana. Let's talk about a banana, a fruit. So, when you see a banana, you can see its color, right? You can see its shape. You can touch it and feel its texture. So there are many properties of a banana, right? Its color, its shape, its weight, structure, etc. But all these properties are held by the substance, which is the banana itself, right? So in other words, uh, these accidents, this color, for example, you can change the color of that banana. For example, uh, it will become blue, right? But for example, you color it with paint. Even if you change the accident, you know that it's still a banana. That which underlies those parts that are not exactly what it is, right? That do not define its nature, like the color, that is called the substance. The substance is that which underlies the accidents. The accidents being those features of the thing which uh, build upon, in a sense, or which are on top of the substance, which underlie it. So, the substance, that it is that which underlies the accidents. The accidents are those parts of a thing that we can sense, the features of a thing that we can sense with our sight, with our taste, with our touch, etc. A substance also has a further function, right? A substance is that which it is not only that which subsists or that which underlies, right, the accidents. It is also that which gives the thing that has those substances and accidents its nature. So it answers the question what it is. So for example, we see the substance of a banana is a banana, right? Banana-ness. The substance of a cat is not only that which that which underlies its fur, right? The color of its fur, etc. That's also true, but it's also that which gives it its even those accidents the nature of cat. So now, the first distinction between real beings. Some real beings are accidents. Some real beings are substances, right? So we see here that Aquinas is a very uh, he attempts to be very broad, right? He's a very broad thinker. So one comparison between Aquinas and Augustine is that Aquinas is like an eagle who flies high in the sky and tries to account for everything that he sees below. Whereas Augustine is like a cave dweller who goes to the ground, right, and looks at things in detail and experiences them. with his entire being, right? Even with his affectivity, with his heart. Aquinas also has that, but he's more of that eagle, right? Who tries to account for everything and see everything as a whole. That's why he accounts for all real being and divides them into substance and accidents. Now let's go to the substance. Substances themselves are have so now before we go to the existence essence distinction, notice that accidents and substances are really distinct, right? They are really different. Even if accidents cannot exist without substances, right? Accidents are really distinct, are really different from substances. So that's an important distinction. Okay, so some two things can exist only together, even if those two things are actually distinct. I think that's difficult to wrap our minds around, but maybe that will be clearer later on. Let's go to existence and essence. So the substance, for example, of the banana has two different aspects, right? We might even say parts, even if that's not very accurate. It has the substance of the banana has the part of it that makes it what it is, right? That gives it its nature. We call that the essence. The essence of the substance of banana is it's that which makes it the kind of thing that it is. A different feature from that is not that which makes it what it is. That's the nature already. The second one is existence, right? There's something in the thing itself that accounts for the very fact that it actually exists. That's existence. Okay, so remember, among all real beings, we find that some beings are accidents, some beings are substances. Among substances, internally we find distinction within them between the essence, that which makes it the kind of thing that it is. So it answers the question what it is. What's a banana? It's a banana. It's banananess. It's that which makes it a banana, right? That's the essence. But why does it exist? Why does something with that nature exist? It is because that substance possesses an existence. Possesses existence. It's the act of existing that is actualizing the nature into reality. Okay. Now let's go back to essence, that which makes the substance the kind of thing that it is. Essence itself has two parts. Normally, for example, the banana. The banana has a form. The form is technically that which makes it, that which gives it the type of configuration, right, or structure that it has. Whereas the matter, it is that which individuates many substances having that one form. For example, let's say I have 5 bananas, right? I have 5 bananas here. They all share a common nature, right? They are all bananas. What do they all share? They all share one thing. But they also differ in another respect. So there's a sense that in which these 5 bananas are one. There's also a sense in which they're different, right? The sense in which they're one is accounted for their common form. So there must be an explanation, right, as to why these 5 things are one, right? And Aquinas and Aristotle simply explains that in terms of a common form. They all share one form, the form of banana. But why is it that even if they share one form, we can still distinguish between them? There has to be a difference between the banana 1, banana 2, and banana 3, right? And banana 4 and banana 5 to make them really distinct beings, right? Because banana 1 and banana 2 are really distinct beings. They are 2 separate and distinct bananas. What accounts for such difference? Here comes in matter, right? Matter is simply that which individuates the bananas. So that's also true for human beings. Even if we all share humanity, right, as a form, we are distinguished. We are able to be multiplied by different chunks of matter, right? this is quite this seems reductionistic, right? Because this makes it look as if human beings are only different in terms of having separate chunks of matter, whereas there's something more than that in reality. And that's one of the criticisms that Aquinas receives, for example, from Edith Stein, right? That Carmelite nun who was a former Jew, a former atheist, who became a Thomist, right? But who is a follower of Husserl. She thinks that Aquinas' view that it is only matter that distinguishes human beings from each other. He sees that as very reductionistic because there's so much more in the personalities, for instance. But the point here is not that the point of Aquinas here is not that it is only matter that is the differentiating feature for among human beings. It's just that it's actually a differentiating feature. He's not saying that that's the only differentiating feature, even if he does perhaps think that that is true. But that does not discredit the fact that that is still compatible with something else being an addition to matter being the individuating feature of or among human beings. So back to the big picture. Notice here that can the yellowness of the banana exist if the banana itself, which underlies such color, does not exist? No, right? In other words, the very existence of the accidents are parasitic on the prior existence of the substance, right? If there's no banana that exists, there can be no color of yellow that we can see there, or green that we can see there, or the taste of the sweet taste that we can taste there. In other words, these accidents are actualized, are made real, are dependent for their actuality on the substance. Notice? Hence, we see even at this very first categorization, Aquinas' act and potency distinction. Now, we need to talk about act and potency, right? In the history of philosophy, at least as understood by Thomists, we find two extremes, right? Heraclitus and Parmenides, right? The Eleatics, right? On the one hand, and Parmenides. For Heraclitus, let's begin with Parmenides. For Parmenides, change is impossible, right? Why is change impossible for Parmenides? Because for there to be change, something in that prior being must begin to exist, right? Out of nothing, so that it will change, right? If there's nothing that would come to be in addition to that prior being that had already existed, then there's no change. But for there to be something else to be added to that prior being, to come to be, to effect the change, that something else, that added being, can only come from where? From non-being, right? Therefore, because that is impossible, because something can never come from nothing, nothing only produces nothing, right? And therefore, for Parmenides, it is not possible that there is change. Change is only illusory, right? Now, that violates common sense, right? Because G.K. Chesterton describes Aquinas as the apostle of common sense. Common sense says that there is actually change, and therefore there must be something wrong in the line of thought, the train of thought that Parmenides took. Heraclitus also goes to the opposite extreme, whereas Parmenides only retained the static dimension of reality, right? Because there's no change. Heraclitus went to the opposite dimension, the opposite extreme. Sorry, dimension. Heraclitus denies identity across time. Everything is changed. Everything is in flux, right? You cannot step in the same river twice. Why? Because when you step on at every point of time that passes, you are no longer you. Nothing endures across time. Everything is changing, right? That's the radical extreme on the other side. That's also not true for Aquinas, because it seems obvious that the banana that undergoes, for example, the stage of becoming ripe, right? Before it was green and then it became yellow. That's a real change, right? So because there's real change there, we can see that probably this must in some way be actually wrong because there's real change. But because the banana that once was green and now is yellow is still the same banana, it's the same substance. So Heraclitus is wrong. Heraclitus is wrong in thinking that nothing endures across time. Now, how does he reconcile? How does he go to the middle of both extremes? Right? Remember Aristotle? For Aristotle, virtue is in the mean, right? The golden mean is in the middle between two extremes. So Aquinas tries to go to the middle of those both extremes. So for him, Parmenides is wrong in thinking that being that has to be added onto prior being for change to be possible has to arise from non-being. Okay. Instead, Aquinas argues that, and Aristotle argues that being is divisible into act and potency. Instead of a being coming from non-being, it's only potency becoming act. Being in potency, transitioning into being in act. Okay. So, for example, the yellowness that emerges in the banana as it becomes ripe, as it changes from green, from not ripe to ripe, the yellowness that arises there does not come from nothing. Instead, it is already contained potentially by the banana that was still not ripe, that was still green. So in other words, the potentiality of the yellowness of the banana is already waiting to be actualized when the banana becomes ripe. So that's the difference between potency and act. Both are real, right? If potency is not real, then Parmenides is right that change is impossible. Potency has to be real because the yellowness must be in some sense real already, while the banana was already green, was still green, right? It must be already real, or else the yellowness just comes from nothing, but something that never come from nothing, right? And therefore, the point stands, right? That the yellowness must already be real in some way, although not in the same way as the greenness already is real. So in other words, reality is in two distinct levels, right? One level is act, the second level is potency. That's the relationship between accidents and substance, right? Accidents are potencies in relation to the substance. Substances actualize, right, the potency of a thing to have a certain, for example, color, to have a certain taste, etc. So now, so we see then that substances actualize the potentiality of a thing to possess certain accidents, right? But now, substances themselves are composites, right, of existence and essence. Which one is act and which one is potency? It's the essence for Aquinas is in potency, is the potency in relation to existence. So what do we mean by that? Natures cannot exist without existence, right? Of course. How could anything exist without existence? It's just analytically contradictory, right? By definition, nothing can exist without existence. So natures cannot exist without existence, right? So it is existence that it is that which makes the essence actual, right? So the act in this distinction, in this relation, is existence, and essence is potency. There's so many ways to spell this out, but we have to skip that much discussion so that we can proceed to form and matter. Essence for Aquinas, or nature, has two parts. Now, this has to be nuanced, right? Because although it is true that naturally in the things around us, in the material beings that we experience, the natures of things are composites of matter and form. We call that hylomorphism. Okay, hylomorphism is the view that things are composites. The natures of things are composites of matter and form. But Aquinas is not a universal hylomorphist. What do you mean by that? He does not think that all beings in the world have natures that are composites of matter and form. There's at least one type of being that has form alone and does not have matter. And for Aquinas, that's the category called angels, right? Angels do not have matter. They're purely immaterial, right? They only have form. And the same is also true for God, right? For Aquinas, God is pure form. God has no matter. But generally, in the things that we observe, there's matter and form, right? What do you mean by that? For example, let's try to see the act potency relationship between matter and form here. I think this is the last part that I have to explain for the sake of time. We have not talked about theology yet, but I think we have to understand these terms because they're crucial to everything of Aquinas, because his metaphysics informs his views in ethics. His metaphysics informs his views in, of course, in theology, right? So even in his theory of mind, right? So you have to understand this. So the form is that which is, it is the principle of actuality. Matter in this case is the principle of potency. That's why, for example, a thing, for example, the banana, it already possesses the form of banana-ness, right? Once it exists as a banana. But that does not mean that it cannot change its nature, right? It still has the possibility to change. For example, suppose you eat the banana, right? Once after you eat it, after you ingest it, will it remain as a banana? No, its nature will change. Its form will change from banana, for example, to feces, right? Now, such feces has to be such the nature of the feces, in a sense. I'm sorry if you're eating right now, has to be already in the banana, or else the nature of the feces would emerge from nothing, right? Would emerge from nothing once you ingest the banana. But because something cannot come from nothing, such feces-ness must already be contained within the banana before it undergoes the change. Not actually, because the banana is only actually a banana and not actually a feces, but it is only potentially a banana. It is already potentially feces, right? So the feces is already there in the banana potentially. Now, notice that the form there is banana-ness, right? So it is in the matter that we can attribute this potency to receive another form. It is it is in matter that we find the principle of chaos, right? Whereas it is in the form that we find the principle of order. If we talk about this in the language of order and chaos. So that's it. Now, in the case of God, God for Aquinas is pure act. God has no potency at all. I think we have to skip this one. The point here only is that Aquinas tries to show that if anything at all has potency, right? This potency here, automatically that being is changeable, right? It is changeable. It is also capable of multiplicity. It is capable of weakness. It is capable of evil, etc. So, in other words, potencies render our being finite. But God is infinite. God has no limitation whatsoever. Therefore, God has no potency, right? Now, notice here that I'm only presenting this to you top down, right? From already in the form of a conclusion of his long process of argumentation of coming to arrive from his experience, right, from the world and his reason. He tries to use both to eventually have this system as a conclusion. So in other words, this system is not an assumption in the case of Aquinas. That's a common mistake, right? It is commonly seen that Aquinas already just believes this by assumption, but that's not true. This entire system is a consequence. It is a conclusion of a long process of a rigorous trying to make sense of both his experience using his natural reason. And then using this conclusion, this set of conclusions, he's able to launch various arguments for the existence of God, wherein his model of God as pure act has certain implications on his view regarding God's nature, right? Because God is pure act, then God cannot change. Because God is pure act, then God is omnipotent. Because God is pure act, God is eternal. God is purely spiritual, right? Because a body is material, right? And because God has no body, then he must be purely spiritual because he has no matter. So etc. etc. So in other words, his system builds on the one hand has two different dimensions. It has two dimensions. On the natural dimension, uh, it builds from experience and then from step by step philosophization. I don't know, is that the correct term for it? By step thinking through of of the conclusions of each inference that he has prior, right, based on experience. The result is this rich metaphysical system. On the other hand, his other datum is divine revelation, right? And he finds in Exodus 3:14, right, when God says, "I am who am," he finds that as a confirmation of what he finds to be a conclusion of natural reason, that God is pure act, his essence, his existence. So unlike the beings in the world, wherein there's a real distinction between their essence and existence, in God, existence and essence are one. There's no real distinction between them. God, to be God, right? The nature of God is to exist itself. These are identical in the case of God, and that's almost the same as what God reveals as His name in Exodus 3:14, right? I am who am. To be me, my nature, the I, to be I, is to be am, right? But what does am mean? It means existence. I exist. My nature is my existence. So in other words, this is Aquinas trying to show that his conclusions in natural reason, using natural reason, are harmonious with his with the data that he discovers using the light of faith, right? Which he finds in scripture and in tradition. So that's it. And Dr. Stump has an important, we might say, nuance here, because we might think of Aquinas as not personalistic, right? He's a very abstract, but actually, for Aquinas, it's persons all the way down, right? At the very foundation of reality is the actual, is the pure act, right? Who is God, who is personal for Aquinas. In fact, tri-personal. So it is not fair for to treat Aquinas as purely as having no personalist dimension. Now, his philosophy of mind, his theory of knowledge, will and action, his views on ethics, etc. We can talk about that. You can discover that on your own, right? You can read about that on your own. If you want recommendations, reading recommendations, I can give you some. If you want podcasts, for example, I really recommend Minds with Aquinas, right? Because that's its main purpose by Matt Fradd, right? To introduce us to Aquinas. Another one is by John De Rosa, the podcast, classicaltheism.com, right? He interviews a lot of Thomists. For example, Gavin Kerr, right? For example, another one is Pat Flynn, who has Philosophy for the People in YouTube, right? He interviews Thomists a lot. For example, James Madden, who wrote a book on Aquinas' philosophy of mind, etc. So there's so much in his talk. We were even not even able to talk about his interpreters, right? There are many traditions in interpreting Aquinas. We were not even able to talk about his theology. But for now, I think it's best to go to the Q&A. Maybe we can continue the discussion. on your terms, right? On areas that you are particularly interested in. Thank you and good night or good evening.
Yes. Okay. So again, give Mark a round of applause. Reaction. React. Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. I am really I'm really enjoying this one. It's just that time limits us. But I think we can talk about having another part 2, Mark. So siguro
Sure.
part 2 which will focus more on kasi we're still scratching yung surface yung surface of
Yes.
the foundation ng understanding ng metaphysics uh, ni Thomas Aquinas and how it actually affects and influences his theology and other aspects in philosophy. So thank you, Mark. I really appreciate you
Thank you, sir.
lecturing us about this. It's an introduction pero it's a deep introduction. I like it. Na hindi lang siya basta introduction. It's well informed. It's well explained. Thank you, Mark, for that wonderful presentation. I think even others who doesn't have a basic understanding who Aquinas is also I think appreciates this. And yeah, we are not going to ask each one kasi kung tatanungin natin isa-isa, it will take time. I think if you have a good kaya parang if you have a question that would really help others to have clarification and you can ask that kind of question kay Mark and let's ask him to answer that one. Any questions sa ating mga nakikinig sa iba't ibang panig ng mundo?
I'd like to no to ask a question Mark regarding to say you made a point a while ago on basically on soteriology and stuff like that. But I would be very I'll be nuanced as possible. So what was that? So here since when you're reading a lot of Thomist works, it seems like there's almost a 50, I'm not sure though, but almost a 50-50 divide between Thomists even, and how can they go by reconcile, foreknowledge and also, foreknowledge and God's decree, and
Yes.
by and how do you approach that? Would you go on more of a compatibilist route, or would you go, say, LFW, or what would how would you? Because it's really hard to understand when you say that Aquinas is there's like a certain decree, right? And then it is not it couldn't be, it should not be, uh, it's kind of identical to his essence, should be. So if you're going to make distinctions in there, then we're going to violate the doctrine of divine simplicity. So if yeah, how do you approach that?
That's a very difficult question, Israel.
Yeah, I'm
And
really also struggling
yeah.
with that. So,
Same. So, but it's very important. It's very important. So let me try. So the question of how to reconcile divine foreknowledge and human free will. Maybe we can go to a text by Aquinas, just one. He wrote in Summa Theologica, see here, part 1, question 22, article 4. He wrote, the effect of divine providence is not only that things should happen somehow, but that they should happen by necessity or by contingency. So in other words, it's already within God's will, God's predestination, God's in fact foreknowledge, because God's predestination, God's decision, right? God's providence and God's knowledge are identical in Aquinas, right? God's knowledge, okay. So because we know that God's knowledge and God's providence are identical, then automatically we can tell that this is also a comment about divine foreknowledge, right? So he says that his providence already, even if it is intrinsically infallible, it is unchangeable, right? It already takes into account both necessary causation among beings. For example, those that do not involve free will, right? Those that occur by deterministic plan, and even those by chance. Now, that's on the contingency side. So now, at the same time, God's divine providence, the divine providence, also takes into account those things that occur by chance, meaning those that are not necessary, those by chance, and even those done not by necessity. Specifically, those that are results of the free decisions of human beings. So this, I really do not have a model of how to reconcile the two, right? The only thing that we have here is an affirmation that both have to be compatible in some way, right? So that's also the thrust in Catholic dogmatic theology. In Catholic dogmatic theology, we are following Aquinas in his affirmation that both are compatible without a definitive way of trying to reconcile them, of a model of how to reconcile them. And I really cannot make a stance as of now as to which of the traditions I should follow, because there are good arguments on both sides, right? There are good arguments on both sides. So the contribution of that is that he says, therefore, whatsoever divine providence ordains to happen infallibly and of necessity happens infallibly and of necessity, and that happens from contingency, which the plan of divine providence conceives to happen from contingency. Okay, so the point here again is that he affirms that even contingent human action, even those that are not by humans, that are by chance, right? Those are already infallible on the side of God because he already foreknows it. I think some of the common Thomistic critiques of Molinism do not work, right? For example, we cannot. I will not dive deep into that because maybe there are other questions. But the point here is that I'm open, right? I'm up as of now because I have not read sufficiently enough to make a judgment on this.
Yeah.
Thanks for the question, Brother Jerome.
Thanks, bro. I think, but it's helpful since it's really hard to ground the cause, no. But I think you
Yes.
made a good point. It's what I'm trying to what I understood is like, correct me if I'm wrong. It's really hard to understand the Aquinas. It's like he's doing what you said. Yeah, he kind of the providence includes human free will. Like he caused
Yes.
human free will. Parang ganun.
Yes. But
Okay.
how? What is the mechanism? What's the mechanism?
That's also what I'm trying to understand.
That's where things get complicated.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, thanks for answering it in a grounding from a more Thomist perspective. So I think parang talaga siya, parang two sides of the same coin. You don't need to reconcile things that are friends. Parang ganon. Magkaibigan naman talaga yun. So bakit mo pa sila i-reconcile kung magkaibigan sila? Hindi naman sila nag-aaway. So, pero of course, there's a lot of nuances in between. Kaya
Yes.
yun yung medyo mahirap intindihan, especially coming from Thomas Aquinas' view. And of course, that's why we have Mark here kasi we needed people who would really help us think through this. Any other question? Jerome, would you like to have some comments? Siguro ano ba si Jerome? Jerome. Bye. Oh, wait lang daw, sabi ni bye. Ben Hur still with us. Siguro nagtutour pa rin yan. Si Rez, si Vic right now sa Thailand. He's listening. And JM, do you have any question? Uziel? Wala naman. Okay lang daw siya. Meron ba? Approve lang. Christine, Ivy. Let's just wait for Jerome. Zuriel, thank you for joining us. Hope to also meet you someday.
Of course, I appreciate you. I'd like to talk to you sana soon. I have some partnerships that I have in mind with our church schools. If you're not very busy.
Sige. Wait lang natin si Jerome kasi Jerome would also have a good comment and reflection about how both of us really appreciate yung understanding Thomas Aquinas and coming from si Jerome Ocampo is coming from a more reformed and more Baptist perspective. So, Jerome, bye. Si Jerome actually, he was just in Davao. He attended si
Mm.
Pastor Arceno.
Nagstay ako near SPBTS.
Really? Wow. San banda? Which specific place? If you remember.
Hindi ko alam pangalan ng siguro i-chat ko in a while.
Pero
Yung
sinong sinayan mo? What's the name? Person?
Rosemilia.
Anyway,
Pero ano lang,
yeah.
sige,
So, ikat muna natin yung ano nyo, yung conversation.
kumustahan?
Mag-chat na lang kayo. Pero again, Jerome Ocampo is also one of the purpose kung bakit ako nag-host ng gantong
Thank you.
talk. Kasi kaming dalawa, usually me and Jerome Ocampo, kaming dalawa lang nag-uusap. So gusto namin din kaming kausap and very limited. We don't want to be isolated sa sarili naming echo chamber na kami lang dalawa nag-uusap and without even outside perspective. And Mark, you're really helpful to this discussion para sa akin and of course sa ating mga nakikinig. Jerome, anything you would like to share, comment, and from a perspective sa sarili mo?
Ayun, siguro ano lang, parang brief background. Earlier years ko talaga parang formation ko talaga more on apologetics. So and apologetics is my long lost hobby, no? Syempre hindi lang naman parang apologetics ang issue when it comes to Christian theology, but anyway, one of which influence ako earlier years ni Norman Geisler, no? And si Norman Geisler, a renowned apologist, in his work, yung kinote ko kanina, hindi ko siya talaga personally binasa. I would say I'm just a secondary reader, no? He mentioned one of the things, background, one of the things na ginagawa ni Norman Geisler when he writes an attribute of God, he will scan through the church history, no, and ano yung comment nila about it. Like for example, isa sa magkasama ay nabanggit ni Mark kanina yung aseity ni God and then yung necessariness, no? Yung necessary didicto in the Thomist tradition. But also at the same time, one of which yung sinasabi nga nila ni Geisler, si God is yung pure actuality, no? How can you respond when it comes to doon sa pure actuality? Sabi kasi, one of the comments, sometimes we are confusing what God is. No, ang ginagamit ko ng word what, no, hindi who. What God is and what He does. So God is unchanging in His attributes. We also agree with that, but engages in changing actions. No? So how do we respond doon sa bagay na 'yon? Kasi sabi ang objection usually God has no passive potency, diba? He has no possibility to be what He is not, but He does have active potency. So power to do what He has not done. So ibig sabihin, the potential to create parang existed in God's active power to create. Ito yung potential move na kung saan magpe-pre-exist ang isang bagay before you move it. So how do we reconcile, no, in a sense na hindi katulad dun sa binanggit ni Pastor JP, how do we reconcile yung bagay na yun, yung what do you call that, yung unchanging attributes ni God, pero at the same time engages us in changing actions. So how will it affect yung understanding natin in reading certain texts in the scripture with regards to actuality? Yun yung last na di ba? Yun yung last na dun sa chart kanina. May sense ba na
Yes.
okay.
Thank you, Sir Jerome. So I think the notion of Cambridge change, uh, appealed to by, for example, Fraser, a Thomist, in this regard, would be helpful. Cambridge changes, as commonly understood, are changes that are wholly accounted for in the patient, and nothing changed in the agent. The patient is the being that is the receiver of the change, and the agent is the cause. I think the notion of a Cambridge change could be used here. One of the examples Fraser gives is, for example, I am Mark, and for example, Zuriel is the second person that we shall be talking about here. And suppose by year 2019, Mark is taller than Zuriel. But
Okay.
by year 2022, Zuriel is already taller than Mark. Mark, that is because Mark did not grow, right? Whereas Zuriel grew at that point of time. So notice here that there's a real change, right? There's change in the relationship between them, but there's no change that happened in Mark. All the change that happened is in Zuriel, and I think that's an example of a Cambridge change, wherein there's a real change in affairs, but it is in only one of the beings that all the change happens. So in the case of God, for example, when he is only doing one action. So in the side of God, there are no multiple actions. God does not change his actions, because actions in God are unlike actions in creatures. Notice that in creatures, actions flow, right? Actions flow from the substance. Actions are really distinct from the substance. Actions are like accidents in that sense, right? But in God, accidents and substances, accidents do not exist, right? God has no accidents. So God's substance is identical with his actions. So if the substance is immutable, the action itself is also immutable. So now, how do we account for changes in the effects in divine action? Now we account them wholly in the changes in the effect, in the second being, which are the creatures. Does that make sense?
Yes. Oh, kasi one of the parang bagay, di ba? Parang the objection would be yung whatever acts in a changing world is changing. So kaya parang in that sense, changing din si God. No? God changes. But yun nga,
sorry.
the of course we are coming most of the time doon sa premise na God is the uncaused cause. No? In order for God to be necessary, he must necessarily exist. No, mga ganung bagay. But yun nga, without reverting doon sa argument na merong parang infinite regression. So yung pure actuality will parang has to parang be differentiated no, doon sa mga finiteness ng actions in way kung paano yung actions ni God contrasted doon sa finitude ng man.
It is I think our inference that changers themselves must change for them to be able to cause change, that inference is drawn by human beings entirely from finite beings, right? Our data from which we drew that inference are all finite beings. So now God is not a finite being. Therefore, that inference cannot be applied to God. God is a sui generis kind of cause.
That's why pala you say the Thomist. Sorry to butt in. I'm very sorry, bro.
Yeah, no problem.
Sorry.
That's why pala
No problem.
Thomist would actually use the term we participate in God, right? They
Yes.
they don't use like sort of more on modern evangelical terms, God's doing or something in it. That's
Yes.
he's something like doing. We participate in God. So by that action, if there's any changes, it is because of your participation, not because God is changing something like that. So
Yes. One example is that one illustration that Aquinas gives is of the sun, right? And
Mhm.
the light of the sun, the light of the sun, and the property of the earth of being illuminated, right? Uh, there can be change on which side of the earth is being illuminated, or whether the earth is illuminated at all. Those changes could happen even if the sun does not change at all. It just keeps on shining, right?
Mhm.
So here we find a case of a cause that has has differences in its effects without the cause itself changing. That's an illustration by Aquinas.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yes. Okay. So I think
Magbigay pa ako ng appreciation.
sige, sige, appreciation Jerome. Sige, appreciation.
Ay, patalo eh. No? Hindi, yun lang. Thank you kay Mark. I think we can, evangelicals, I don't want to be broad, Baptist, especially the Southern Baptist, no, can really learn from Thomas Aquinas. Yung na-mention niya kanina ni Mark, si Peter Kreeft, no? Isa sa mga contemporary and dialogues talaga to ni Geisler, nila William Lane Craig. He's a Catholic theologian, no? But yun nga, since biyasa siya kay Aquinas, and in the field ng apologetics, they learn from from Aquinas. Siguro by next time ko na itatanong when it comes doon sa natural theology, no. But yun nga, Southern Baptist should appreciate yung heritage na binigay through Thomas Aquinas, because Aquinas shows us na pave the way na reason and faith hindi sila kailangang mag-away, no? And also at the same time, it teaches us yung philosophy ng worldview natin, no? First and foremost, theology is about philosophy, and di ba the church fathers parang flourish in the Platonic worldview when it comes to understanding things. So in other words, reason has really something to say when it comes to doing yung ating theology. We might not embrace in totality yung tinuturo ni Aquinas, but the substance, especially arguing doon sa natural theology, we have something to learn so that we will not deviate doon sa parang orthodox teaching ng church. I think yun lang naman ang parang isa sa mga appreciation ko talaga. And yun nga, yung allergy minsan ng Southern Baptist na pag nakarinig ng Roman Catholic, as if parang they have nothing to contribute when it comes to how we do yung theology natin. Of course, they are always looking doon sa Reformation period alone, no? But not on ways paano talaga ito napunta, and how yung Queen of Sciences, which is yung theology, should be embraced and cherished in our Baptist tradition. So yun lang. Thank you kay Mark and kay Pastor JP.
Yeah. So Mark, we're really appreciative when it comes sa yung discussion. Thank you rin sa, I think, marami atang Christian think tank dito, no? Sa inyo, si Rel, si Mark, si Zuriel. So thank you for opening this sa inyo ring grupo. And yeah, again, at least you now know na meron kayong mga friends coming from Baptist na
bro, that's actually why I'm very glad.
So, diba, na who shares
I don't know any Southern Baptist na interested in here. That's why I'm very glad.
Yeah. So you have people like us who shares the same perspective, and of course yung love sa understanding of philosophy and theology put together. So maraming gusto natin itanong, pero we will just stop this muna and we'll have another part 2. Siguro pag-usapan na namin ni Mark, we can do that one. Pero for this discussion, in conclusion, we have learned about the life of Thomas Aquinas, yung kanyang short story, and how he sees and perceives yung metaphysics that influences his theology. There's an affirmation coming from Thomas Aquinas ng immutability, impossibility of God, and he totally rejects yung process theology, which is yung pantheism. And with that itself is very fruitful. Malaking part na ng contribution sa discussion na ating meron tayo, and we are all enjoying that, and we are grateful for that one. Mark, thank you so much. Thank you, Zuriel. Rez, thank you for joining us. Rovik, Thailand, JM from Paranaque, Uziel from Manila, Ivy sa Las Piñas, si Christine from Baguio, and Ben-Hur from Tugigaraw sa may Cagayan, sa may northern part ng Luzon. And Jerome Ocampo from Muntinlupa. And me from New Jersey. And si Mark, of course, from Bohol. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Ipas
Thank you so much, sir.
longer. Nagana tayo, sumobra tayo ng 37 minutes, pero it was a good discussion. Maraming question and answer na maganda ring natanong. Mark, let's just do this again. Siguro bago tayo matapos, pwede tayo mag-picture taking. Picture taking tayo. Okay, 1. Smile tayo, smile. Sige, 1.
Driving ako, driving.
Sige. 1, 2, 3. Yan. So, isa-send ko na lang sa inyo. Yung video ng recorded video, I'll just send the link din as well. I'll upload it unlisted sa YouTube natin.
From mailaw si Ben-Hur, naging madilim ah.
Thank
Drive ako, nagda-drive.
Bye-bye.
Driving.
Bye-bye, sir. Thank you for the invitation, Sir
Thanks,
Jerome.
Mark.
Sir
Thanks,
Pastor
Mark.
Absolutely. See you tomorrow.
Bye-bye.